女士们、先生们，欢迎来到第10届世界和平论坛第3场大会。Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third plenary session of the 10th World Peace Forum. Hope you have enjoyed the intriguing discussions this morning. And before we proceed, I would like to kindly remind our distinguished audience to please make sure all your electronic devices are muted. Thank you. Now, let's welcome Professor Yan Xuetong and our distinguished speakers for the next plenary session, the United Nations and World Order.
首先感谢我们今天来参加我们这次论坛的这个5位嘉宾。大家也知道我们这场呢，实际找了5位嘉宾，分别代表这个 P5。那么从今天参会的这个人数，大家也看出来了，这个大家对这场呢极其的关注。可能是比我们对其他的场次，包括昨天的这个重要的发言，都更加关注。所以可能大家说，昨天晚上我们特意加了椅子，就知道今天人会非常的多。但是呢，我们人很多，希望大家呢，我们能够保持一个良好的秩序，把我们这场的讨论呢，这个能够进行的非常的有效。那么我今天呢，这个请来了这个5位嘉宾。一个是俄罗斯这个美国的大使伯恩斯先生。先介绍伯恩斯的原因，是因为在所有的这些个4位大使里边，而伯恩斯是最新鲜的大使，就是他是刚来，来的时间最短，其他大使来的时间比较长。然后我们还有俄罗斯大使来的最时间长的大使，那来了这已经这个很长时间。这个去年还参加了我们的这个论坛，因为我们英国大使吴大使，我们吴大使和这个宾特大使都能说非常好的汉语，可以用汉语和你们直接交流。这是去年也参加了我们的这个，然后。
Chinese, and you can talk to Ambassador Denisov in Chinese, and French Ambassador Lauren Billy also attended last year's forum, and the 3 ambassadors contributed very good discussions to our forum last year, and today you are joined by the American ambassador.
我们这是一个 discussion， 是个 panel。这个，所以呢，我们先请每位大使呢，先用10分钟，然后这方面呢，先用10分钟谈谈你的基本看法，就是联合国如何发挥作用，维护世界和平。然后呢，第2轮，然后我会问一些问题，让每位大使们还有3到5分钟，您做决定，再来发表第2轮的看法。然后我们再开放给这个3 to 4 minutes， 好吧？那么既然是伯恩斯大使呢是来到中国任职比别人晚，所以呢我们先请这伯恩斯大使先发言。好，请您发言。
Ambassador Burns.
大家好。Good morning, everyone. I want to thank my friend, the Dean, Yan Xuetong, for that beautiful introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank all of my colleagues for being here as well, and I think that the topic of the United Nations and World Order is the right one for this morning. I just wanted to begin, Dean, with just 3 points. And then I look forward to listening to my colleagues. The first point is the obvious one, and that it's nice to be back in a university setting for me. I want to pay tribute to Tsinghua. It's a great global university, and the university can be very proud of what it's accomplished through many, many years. And I'm back, in a way, it doesn't really feel like a university setting here. It feels like the United Nations. But I spent the last 13 years teaching at Harvard University as a professor. I had lots of Chinese students. And those Chinese students represent about 300,000 Chinese students across the United States. That's a remarkable bridge between the United States and China. It's a durable bridge. There are nearly 11 million Chinese citizens who have received part of their education in the United States. And I thought, just thinking about the world order and the U.S.-China relationship, it's a complicated relationship, as you know. But we have to keep our people meeting with each other, learning from each other, studying with each other. Here at Tsinghua, where there's a major American scholarship program, but also in our universities across the United States. And may that durable bridge keep our two societies connected. That's the first thing I wanted to say about the importance of academic freedom, the importance of a civil debate on very difficult issues. The second thing I wanted to say this morning in these brief remarks is just a comment about world order. It's a big topic. We could, Professor, we could organize a course at Tsinghua or my old university, and it might take us several semesters to get to the end of examining the world order. Obviously, the 5 countries represented on this dais have a lot to do with world order. The structural responsibilities that come to us for world peace and security at the founding of the United Nations is one of the most important responsibilities that each of our government has individually and that we have collectively. And there's no question that the United States and China, and I'm responsible for managing that relationship here in China, we bear a special responsibility. We're the 2 largest global economies. We're the 2 most powerful militaries in many ways. We're both globally oriented. And it's no secret. We have a complex, complicated, and competitive relationship. And that's the honest truth about this relationship. Had we been meeting 10 years ago on this dais, Professor, or 15 years ago, I think we would have, an American or a Chinese representative would have said, we are engaging each other, and we have a strategy of engagement, and we do compete on some issues. But in 2022, an honest assessment of the relationship, I think on both sides, is that we have a competitive relationship and we seek to engage as well. And that has a lot to do with the complexities of world order and of many of the problems that we see around the world. Where are we competing? Certainly on economics and trade, where we have some fundamental disagreements about the application of the World Trade Organization rules and regulations. We're competing certainly on technology, particularly if you think about the important commercial and security/military implications of the advent of artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum sciences, biotechnology. That's a second area. Third, we're certainly competing, both governments would acknowledge this, on security issues. In the Indian Ocean, in the Western Pacific, we have major disagreements about, we certain Americans have major disagreements, I don't want to speak for the PRC government, about PRC activities in the Spratly and Paracels, in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea on the Senkaku Dayu issue. Those are important differences, including in cyber policy and cyberspace. And fourth, we're obviously competing in the realm of values. I won't comment, obviously, leave to my Chinese colleague to articulate China's view of its own values and how it projects them. I can only say, special day for the United States. It's the 246th anniversary of our Declaration of Independence. I have to say this, from the United Kingdom. But in the last 200 years or so, we've become the closest of allies, and thank you to the French for helping us win the decisive Battle of Yorktown in October 1781. We have it memorized, Caroline. But completing this issue of values, that document published 246 years ago, it's centered around human freedom and human rights and the rights of people to choose their own leaders and to throw them out of office should they not like those leaders. And that's been the basis of our democracy for 246 years. We have a values difference. So China and the United States are going to be competing. And we need, obviously, to compete in such a way that we mitigate the possibility of an unintentional conflict between us, which neither of us wants. And both of us want a peaceful relationship between our two countries. And that gets to world order. Because how we relate to each other in this very important 21st century rivalry will have an obvious impact on world order, given the strength of both countries. But it also demands something else. And that is that China and the United States seek to work together on areas where world order is most closely in question. And so both of us have a responsibility, and we acknowledge this to each other, to work on climate change. And we are working on climate change together. We do not have identical views about 2030 and about the need for both of us to actively, urgently reduce our carbon emissions. I think China's about nearly one-third of global carbon emissions are with China, about 11% with the United States, but we bear joint responsibility. And we wish to work with China on climate change. Global health. The United States and China seek to work together. We've had some constructive discussions just in the past week on that. We have a major disagreement, which we have to be open about. The U.S. hopes that China will work with the WHO on its latest investigatory report. There was an interim report June 6th to transfer the necessary data to allow all of us around the world to have a better understanding of the origins of the coronavirus. That's a remaining responsibility for China, which is very important. We seek to work together on counter-narcotics. Chinese black market companies are exporting precursor chemicals, and this is not the Chinese government, but Chinese companies, to drug trafficking cartels in Mexico and Central America. That produces the synthetic opioid fentanyl, and fentanyl is a curse on our country. 110,000 Americans died of drug overdose in the last year, 70% of them fentanyl deaths. So we seek to work together in a constructive way so that the Chinese government might help us, help the government of Mexico, and the government of the United States, all of us, three of us working together to deal with this. And obviously, we want to work together on food security. And that's very important because we're looking at a possible food crisis around the world, in parts of Asia, in parts of Africa and the Middle East, all around the world, because of the war in Ukraine. And that gets to my final point, Mr. Chairman, Professor, and that is Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. The fact that Russia crossed the border with an armed force, unprovoked, and has started this war with so much human suffering, so many innocent civilians dead in Ukraine. This is a direct violation of the United Nations Charter. It's a direct violation of what the Russian Federation signed up to when it became a member state, a continuation state in 1991, after the demise of the Soviet Union. And the attacks on Russia, on Ukrainian grain silos and warehouses, the use of armed force to blockade Ukrainian ports means that the people of Egypt and other places in the Middle East, countries in East Africa and the Horn of Africa, countries here, including China, are not able to have the free flow of grains and other agricultural products from Russia. There's a food security crisis, and it's been compounded by this illegal, unjust, and brutal war of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. Mr. Chairman, I would conclude my remarks by saying this. The greatest threat to the world order is the Russian war in Ukraine. and I think it's the hope of all the world, 141 countries voted to denounce this war in the General Assembly, is for the war to be ended. Thank you very much.
好，谢谢伯恩斯大使。你时间控制得非常好，非常准确，10分钟，这个给我们树立了一个好的这个样板。那么既然呢您提到了关于当前的这个乌克兰战争，下面呢我们请俄罗斯大使金涅夫索夫先生呢来发言。
Dear Professor Yan Xie-tong, distinguished colleagues, dear friends, fellow ambassadors, regardless of what my American colleagues has said about Ukraine and that crisis with all that words like illegal, unprovoked, human sufferings, and so on and so forth. I totally disagree, and I can oppose each and every sentence of that intervention. But let me please, due to diplomatic courtesy and traditions, remind all of you that today, July the 4th, is National Day of the United States of America, and convey my congratulations on that national holiday to distinguished American ambassador and all his colleagues in this hall. Just one remark. The most crucial in that, the final words of distinguished American ambassador, let alone all that illegal, unprovoked. I can say a lot about whether it was provoked or not by 5 waves of NATO expansion, by everything what was happening since 2014. Remind of all that desperate efforts by my country to promote Minsk agreement and complete failure due to the position of our opponents. But one is most crucial, that is mentioning of human sufferings and life losses. That human sufferings started in 2014 and life losses took place almost all the time since that period. Started in Odessa in firing alive several dozen innocent people, civilians, and then further on. So everything, as Chairman Mao said once, 每个现象有一个方面，有另一个方面. Each phenomenon has one side and another side. So let's not fix on one side and say complete truths about that tragedy which is going on my native Ukraine. I was born in Ukraine, on Ukrainian mother. So I suffer personally much more than anybody who speaks so critically about my country and my country's policy in that particular case. I'll stop here with that unfortunate topic and keep closer to the up to the point, to the agenda item. And the agenda item is United Nations and World Order. Let me please remind you the words by very well known to all of you, the words of Sir Winston Churchill, who said once, the UN was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. And facing severe global challenges, the world is going now through crucial transformation. The existing system of international relations is being reshaped. We witness the persistent efforts to substitute the universally recognized international law with so-called rules-based order, which reflects views of small number of countries only, rather than of international community as a whole. We have constantly stressed the extreme danger of attempts to subvert the authority of the United Nations, undermine the polycentric system of international relations. We now stand one step away from the abyss into which we are being pushed by sabotage of the normal UN functioning. Obsession with politicizing everything and instigating confrontation has nothing to do with the purposes of the UN Charter. The UN Security Council remains an important and powerful tribune which has historically proved its capability to find solutions to the most complex and severe crises in various parts of the world. The true meaning of the UN is often lost in the struggle of narratives. The UN Security Council attention is being diverted to secondary objectives, including those that even do not fall under the mandate at all. Our common task is to preserve the functioning mechanism of the UN, which we still see as a main platform for supporting global peace and stability. Unfortunately, the Council is gradually losing its ability to engage in constructive discussions. Instead of searching for solutions to the most complicated problems and reaching compromise, our partners often opt for the easiest way possible. They provoke the use of veto or abstention during voting on different documents. We need to seek for agreement. We need to listen to each other and hear what our counterparts in the Council have to say. But today we see the opposite trend associated with behind-the-back allegations, dictation, and manipulations, and it's truth. It's not just imaginary. On some episodes, like Ukraine, mentioned above, the situation has become absurd. After one balanced and more or less constructive resolution on Ukraine, which was unanimously adopted in Security Council in spring this year, the Security Council has almost been turned into the arena for speaking out propaganda narratives. The views are presented as ultimate truth and in a very harsh, boorish, Russophobic manner. These destructive steps drive UN Security Council members further apart, making our work less efficient, if not inefficient at all. Against this backdrop, the need for the UN reform is particularly acute. Few words about Russia's position on the reform of the Security Council, which is only one of the agenda items in reforms plans within the United Nations. My country stands for the expansion of the membership of the UN Security Council on the basis of broad consensus. This requires increasing the share proportion of African, Asian, and Latin American states so that the Security Council could reflect the aspirations of the peoples of the world and become more democratic. These are citing UN Charter. At the same time, I'll be frank, we are not ready to support the entry of such players as Germany and Japan into the Council as permanent members. See no value added in bringing them in, given the current balance, or better to say disbalance, but anyway, what is the real composition in the P5, the participation of those mentioned above, of the candidates, is unlikely to strengthen the balance and make the disbalance even more vivid. On the other hand, we are open to the perspective of India and Brazil joining the Council. We have constantly advocated that the UN Security Council should be as representative as possible in given circumstances, of course. Despite the difficulties, the UN remains a unique a unique organization, a unique institution. It is our hope that the preservation and improvement of this platform will be helpful to keep international relations within the rule of law and help to preserve global peace and stability. No other ground for that does exist. Thank you very much. 谢谢各位关注。
谢谢杰尼索夫大使，他认为大国要维护世界秩序，应该不用对抗的方法。那我现在呢，得向贾教授做一个道歉。刚才在接受这个诸位这个参会时候，我把我的这个老朋友这个贾庆国教授呢给忽视了。这个当然他不是大使，这个什么，我觉得可能是因为我们两个人关系太近了，我把这个事儿了，这是应该是个 guest。不是一个是我们的这个family member， 所以刚才这里先表示一个歉意啊，对不起，秦国。这个下边呢，我们请吴若兰大使来发言，大家欢迎。
OK， 是上午还是上午？好像还是上午。大家好，非常感谢，确实我非常荣幸今天来到清华。虽然其实我们不在校院，但是还是不错。跟那么多学生在一起能够聚会，确实，这个是非常珍贵的一个机会，特别是在一个可以说非常动荡不安的这个情况之下，而且在这国际秩序
international。
所以我认为我们谈这个话题，确实非常准确。而且呢，我非常高兴看到那个 title 就是 upholding and reforming the global order。因为我们如果不支持，我们如果不捍卫以规则和法律为基础的国际体系，我们没法把它打开。所以这个是第一个前提。If you don't uphold the international order, you can't do anything further with it. And I would like to start, it might not surprise you, from where my American colleague has just left off, that how can you have a global order where a member of the Permanent Five Security Council has invaded, ripped up the UN Charter and invaded a sovereign country, its neighbour? So that's where I'd like to start off. But I will talk about other things as well. 但是我想说几句话，因为你们是学生，反正有好多外交官在这里，也有学生，是不是？所以我认为学生最愉快的一个事情，除了酒吧以外，最愉快的一个事情是什么？是反身而成，是乐莫大焉，是不是 ？So, it's about being critical. It's about you judging. It's about judging on the facts. It's about seeking the facts. So I invite you to consider the facts, and I'm going to give you some facts today. And I want to thank Professor Yan Xuetong， 非常感谢您，因为确实在这个时刻能够聚会也很不容易，所以谢谢你所做出的安排。Yan 教授，他是去年 Professor Yan said last year that the world was in an uneasy peace. Well, I think a year later,we would wish that we could return, that we could return to even an uneasy peace would be a fine thing. Because it is scarcely believable that just a year ago, people in Ukraine were leading peaceful lives. They were leading ordinary lives. Lives have been destroyed. Thousands have been killed, and millions are suffering, displaced, following the absolutely horrific invasion by Russia. And the numbers are staggering.Who would have foreseen how quickly the international order would have been challenged? I should also say it is not just people who have been a casualty of this conflict, but truth has been a casualty of this conflict. The Russian ambassador said there's one side and the other. Well, there is. There's the truth, and there's distortion and disinformation and fake news. And I invite you to consider the facts here.Again, I have a rather lovely Chinese quote for you. 是蒙子，当然是蒙子，必须是蒙子，是不是？所以这个是道就像大陆一样，难道是难以了解吗？ 人们的问题不肯去探求罢了。
The problem is that people do not want to explore.
So
it's a long way,
I
but
invite you
I
to
would
consider those facts. 12 million displaced, 6 million people needing aid. As I've said, a P5 member ripping up the UN Charter, and a war of choice based on lies, a war not based on defense. You may hear sometimes, I think we just heard from the Russian ambassador, 5 waves of NATO expansion. I wonder why NATO had to expand. Who was it who invaded Georgia? Who was it who invaded Ukraine? Who was it who stationed troops in Moldova without their asking or permission? It is clear. Russia has a border of 20,000 kilometers. 20,000. Russia's an extremely big country. 1/16th of that borders on NATO, with NATO countries. The prime responsibility for this war is clear. The prime responsibility for the war is with Russia. NATO is a purely defensive alliance. NATO has acted with extraordinary restraint regarding Russia. And the costs of this war, let us be clear, this is not just a regional European security problem. As my US colleague, the Ambassador Burns, has said, the consequences extend far, far beyond into food insecurity. We risk destitution, and the poorest risk hunger. And again, let me be clear, it is not sanctions that are causing the problems with food insecurity. Oh no, Russia is exporting grain as normal. There are exemptions from the sanctions for the export of food. It is the grain from Ukraine that it cannot be exported due to a blockade by Russia. That is the problem. And I call today on Russia to lift this blockade and to ensure that over 320 million people globally who are facing food insecurity do not do so. As for responsibilities for the global order, I was interested to hear the Russian ambassador quote Churchill. UN saving us from hell. Well, he's right. It is hell at the moment. We do need the UN to save us, frankly. I'll tell you something else that Churchill said. He said when the war was raging at its height in 1944, Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, he said, the UN is the only hope of the world. And indeed, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who was also a delegate to the UN General Assembly, said that the UN is our greatest hope for future peace. The UN, in fact, was born out of desperation, fear, a sense of urgency and common purpose. And my goodness, we have that at the moment. We have the fear, we have the desperation, but I can assure you, many of us have the sense of urgency and common purpose as well. We absolutely do. And we need the UN more than ever. And forums like the UN, which bring the whole of the global community together, and I should say there are just 5 of us on this platform, but there are other members of the Security Council. There are 15 of them, actually. And some of them all of them, I should think, are represented here today. I can see some of them. And every nation is a member of the Security Council. And we all have a responsibility, but we on this platform have a very special responsibility. Well, what is our first duty? Our duty first is, of course, to preserve the global order. Well, the UN Charter, the first thing it does, one of the most important things it does, not the only thing, is to guarantee national sovereignty and territorial integrity. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights is also part of the UN Charter, as are the Sustainable Development Goals. So are the laws of war, which predate the UN. Yes, even war should be conducted in an, inverted commas, civilized manner, if that's possible. All higher goals have to rest on this solid foundation. 确实是密不可分的，我们达不到这些目标，我们什么都达不到。And the alternative is not a different global order, but if another country on this platform, Russia, had their way, I'm afraid it would be global anarchy. We have to uphold this order. The rest of us have to uphold this order. And I am very proud of what the United Kingdom has done to support Ukraine and to support the people of Ukraine, because you don't uphold the international order simply by words. Sometimes you have to fight for the international order. So when I hear people criticizing supply of arms to a sovereign country, I think, well, how would you have it otherwise? You would let another country invade that country and the rest of us as well, maybe. So, I would say one word on China, if I may. I have 1 minute left. I don't think that will be long enough. 但是我开始好不好? Sometimes people ask, is China a status power or revisionist? Well, I'm not going to answer that question. But what I would say is that if you aspire to change the system, the first thing you have to do is to respect the system. That is absolutely fundamental. And if China does seek to change the system, it will be most credible in doing so if it shows it is truly, truly committed to the existing system. So in the limited time I have left, I just want to say one thing. We give ourselves the greatest prospect of success if we commit unequivocally to uphold an international order of rules and responsibilities. And here today, I'm sure, are some of the future leaders of China. And you have a great responsibility. Some of you will lead its government, maybe, its companies or other aspects of society. And I would just leave you with one more thing. 从则独胜其身，达则天上天下，是不是？切记 ，sorry. Thank you， 谢谢。
谢谢吴大使。吴大使最后用了这个穷则独善其身，达则兼济天下，中国的传统文化来总结。那个刚才还提到了，就是说，我去年讲是 an easy peace， 今年是不是还是那样？那么对世界是发生了性质变化还是程度变化？我想一会儿我们可以再讨论。那么下面呢，我们要请这个罗良大使先生呢来发言。我们由于是欧洲的代表，也是我们 P5 的重要代表。
Merci beaucoup. 谢谢您。Thanks for the occasion to express French views, often European ones, on the present situation of the world order. A situation that we Europeans think was not a fatality, and you may remember the energy that President Macron spent to try to change the course of events. But we all understand now that it was perfectly planned by the Russian side, who refused diplomacy and chose war. For the Chinese audience, I may have to recall that France and Russia enjoy a high degree of respect for their respective culture. Since the Franco-Russian Friendship Alliance of 1891, we have been allied in 2 world wars, and we have a lot of respect for the sacrifices made by the former Soviet Union to defeat the Nazis. As an anecdote, when I was a child, Franco-Russian was a brand of delicious dessert because everything being Russian was supposed to be good and sweet. In the last 30 years, we spent quite some energy to overcome the fractures of the past, including, to give you an example, but there are many, by welcoming Soyuz satellite launcher onto our launching site in French Guiana. Russian aggression is therefore even more a shock. During these 3 days, a lot will have been said of the complexity of the war in Ukraine. European history is inherently complex. But allow me to quote the French sociologist Edgar Morin, survivor of the Holocaust, who from the top of his 100 years of age is observing our world. I quote, "Simplicity is in the fact that there is an aggressor and an attacked, that the aggressor is a great power and the attacked a peaceful nation." End of quote. Allow me also to quote Da Wei, director of the Center for International Strategy and Security. I quote, "Among all the uncertainties, one thing is certain. What the Russian troop crossed on February 24 was not simply the land border between Russia and Ukraine, but rather more, symbolically, the river Rubicon of the post-Cold War international order." End of quote. Indeed, as the President of the French Republic reminded us, the events that have taken place since the Russian offensive on February 24 are a turning point in the history of Europe. The deliberate choice by Russia to attack Ukraine contravenes all the commitments made by the Russian authorities and constitute an unacceptable and indisputable violation of the Charter of the United Nations and all the founding principles of the European and international order. As a French diplomat in China, I understand the difference of perspective between our countries on a war which is taking place on the European continent, and I respect them. It is, of course, legitimate for China to decide our position based on its own perceptions. However, I believe we share a certain number of principles that should pave the way, if not to a lasting solution to the conflict, at least to an alleviation of the sufferings. First, we believe that sovereignty and territorial integrity must be preserved. Second, I think we share the view that global challenges should involve more cooperation and that the disintegration of the international order is in the interest of no one. Third, Europe and China have traditionally jointly upheld multilateralism and advocate for peaceful conflict resolution. It is never too late to join efforts to help cease the war and achieve long-term peace and security. Fourth, both Europe and China care about humanitarian assistance. There is room to work jointly, both bilaterally and in the UN, to address this issue effectively and to resist its weaponization by more cynical actors. Fifth, China is more than welcome to support Europe's effort to try to limit the war's global consequences, for example, by joining the initiative Food and Agriculture Resilience Missions, which aim to tackle the food crisis triggered by the blockade of Ukraine's airboats by Russia and in the impact of the war on this year's harvest. Let me present our understanding of the present situation and what these conflicts entail for Europe. I have indeed read a lot of interesting comments. In the light of these numerous analyses, I must urge you to always recall a simple truth. Ukraine didn't attack Russia and doesn't have any territorial claim over Russian territory. Nor was Russia under NATO pressure. With all due respect, the last countries that joined NATO, such as Albania, North Macedonia, or Montenegro, did not upset the strategic balance in Europe. On the other hand, Europe undoubtedly was too quick in assuming, after the collapse of the USSR, that a full-scale war in Europe was now unthinkable, reaping the dividend of peace and reducing the size of their armed forces by almost 50%. More than the so-called NATO's military pressure, Russian war of aggression is a consequence of Europe's disarmament. The so-called Russian special operation was indeed expected to be easy, but due to the Ukrainian supposed division and Europe's weakness, the resistance and courage of the Ukrainian people didn't allow it to succeed. The Europeans were quick to react. I quote President Macron, "Our Europe, since the first day of the conflict, has been able to react quickly in an historic and united ways by adopting sanctions 2 days later and on 6 occasions." End of quote. I hear the rhetoric about an overly emotional Europe being unable to address the crisis rationally, and patronizing comments about Europeans being the puppets of the United States, or Europeans being passive actors, or Ukraine being used as a proxy. For the proxy, again, I don't think Ukraine, whose people are dying in large numbers and which is being destroyed, didn't call for Russian aggression. It is Russia's aggression that is pushing the Europeans closer to the US. In an alternative and twisted presentation of the truth, some, however, deliberately choose to switch causes and consequences. I also hear that the US and the West full-out economic war against Russia, causing severe energy and food crisis. May I humbly recall that the sanctions are a consequence of the war and not the other way around, that their aim is to encourage Russia to stop destroying eastern Ukraine by a massive carpet bombing. Sanctions are a way to show opposition and to exert pressure onto an aggressor without escalating to a third world war. May I finally recall that it is the Russian blockade of the Ukrainian harbors of the Black Sea that is responsible for the grain shortage. EU sanctions do not target Russia's agricultural sector and have been designed and continue to be adapted to specifically prevent this sort of side effects. But the most outrageous of the accusation is the one aimed at blaming the Europeans for prolonging Ukrainian suffering because of their military support. Should the victim be encouraged to commit suicide to end their suffering, or should we provide them with help and assistance? On that particular point, I will just quote the respective words of two of the world-famous conscience, Victor Hugo and Lu Xun. The crimes of force are and remain crimes. Public horror is a penalty. Lies written in ink cannot hide facts written in blood. I also hear that Europe is having a PTSD, a post-traumatic stress disorder, and therefore we are just siding with the US. I'm in the contrary, confident that it will strengthen our determination to rely more on ourselves. French President Jacques Chirac, well known in China, liked to recall an old adage: law without force is more often force without law. This is what we see at work in Ukraine. I'm pretty sure that our continent is not going to be the same for the decade to come. In retrospect, we must admit that the Europeans committed a denial of reality in the face of the continued weakening of the security architecture inherited from the Cold War. We now have to prepare to the worst, to make sure it won't happen. The raise of the EU military spending and reinforcement of EU's external border is a first step in that direction. The recognition of the status of candidate country to the European Union to Ukraine and Moldova is also a very strong message. The proposition of a European political community by President Macron could quickly lead to deepening the ties between the EU and these countries. The EU NATO will be modified. The accession of two European neutral countries, deeply pacifist, but like the other European, shocked by Russian aggression, is a sign. And a stronger US military presence in Europe will be welcomed by its member states. These evolutions will contribute to the re-establishment of a certain strategic balance in Europe and should deter further aggression. But in the short term, it's still time to stop this madness. Overall, the present situation reminds us that there are no easy wars. It's a lesson for all. The post-Cold War European security architecture didn't manage to preserve the peace we aspire. It's now time for diplomats to work. We do not have to jump to the conclusion that a new Cold War is the only option. Let's work together to preserve the world order. Let's preserve the United Nations spirit. 谢谢大家。
好，刚才谢谢这个罗良大使。罗良大使认为，这个维持这个战略平衡还是一个维持地区稳定的重要方法。那现在呢，我们请贾清国教授谈一谈联合国如何维护这个世界秩序和和平。
So I would like to give the floor to Mr. 贾清国。
I wish we have a forum.
Thank you very much, Professor Yan.
So that I can invite him back. I feel honored and privileged to be invited here. I'm sorry I'm not an ambassador, so I have to be different somehow. Other members of the panel talk about official, at least versions of their views. I only talk about my own view. I don't talk about views of any institutions I'm affiliated with as an academic. I think the United Nations is an international organization with universal representation. Its missions including maintaining international peace and security, developing friendly relations among nations, and achieving international cooperation. Since its founding, it has played a very useful role in that regard and has earned respect of most countries in the world. I'm wondering whether all countries in the world. The UN has been part of the post-war international order and also a principal instrument of maintaining that order. Since its founding, its effectiveness to live up to its responsibilities has been hampered by a number of factors: the Cold War, the reluctance of the member states especially the major powers, to delegate power to the institution, and the inability on the part of the UN National Security Council to keep up with the change in power distribution. And most recently, the division between the permanent members of the UN Security Council, especially between China and the US. So it's still an institution with great potential, unrealized. China has been one of the founders of the UN for a long time after the PRC was founded. It was excluded from that institution because of the US policy of containment and isolation. Since the restoration of China's seat in the UN in 1971, the PRC has become a strong supporter of the UN. It has repeatedly called for the respect of the UN authority. Its membership fee to the UN now is second only to that of the US. It has been the second largest financial contributors to the UN peacekeeping operations. And China has also dispatched more peacekeeping troops to the UN operations than any other P5. The current world order consists of the UN and other international organizations and international laws and norms. Much of it has been adopted and shaped through extensive consultation among member states since the end of the World War II. The US has played a leading role in that process. Ever since the current world order took shape, there have been two interpretations as to what it means, the international order. One interpretation is advocated by the West. It prioritizes ideological values such as individual liberties, human rights, and democracy. The other interpretation is favored by most other countries. It prioritizes some secular values such as territorial integrity, sovereignty, economic development, and collective security. One can find both sets of values in the UN Charter and the international laws and norms. During the Cold War, the world was split into two camps: the communist or the socialist camp and the capitalist camp led by the West. The West called its camp as the so-called free world. One consequence of the adoption of the policy of openness and reforms in China, and also the collapse of the Soviet Union, was the emergence of a truly integrated international order. At the height of its power, the West tried to impose its interpretations of the world order and call it liberal international order. For a time, it was said that international order has become anachronistic and has to be reformed. The world has to move on. Therefore, one hears the argument that human rights come before sovereign rights. That provided the rational basis, the rationale for NATO's armed intervention in the Kosovo crisis. During the Trump administration, the US pursued a policy of America first. It withdrew from many international institutions and international agreements. It undermined the work of the WTO It launched trade wars against other countries, especially China. It even attacked its allies for taking advantage of the US. As a result, the appeal of the liberal international order drastically declined. The China-US vicious interactions during that period accelerated this development. The Biden administration has tried to reverse Trump's policy. It has taken measures to recommit itself to the defense of the existing international order. However, for various reasons, it has continued much of Trump's policy on China. Under the circumstances, China-US rivalry has grown even more tense. One consequence of China-US rivalry is that it threatens to undermine not only the liberal international order, but also the secular international order, which is based upon such values as national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and development. More recently, Russia's efforts to address its grievances with Ukraine has dealt a further blow to the secular international order, at least in two ways. First, it started the practice to separate a country through instigating a plebiscite, such as to separate Crimea from Ukraine. Second, it reinforced the practice of using force to address a grievance with another country, such as Ukraine. Russia, of course, is not alone in doing so. Remember US war against Iraq during the Second Gulf War? And also Israel's military operations in the Middle East. Why do we care about the international order? I think despite all of its flaws, the current world order is probably still the best that mankind or humankind has ever created. There are many virtues to it. In the second place, most countries in the world have a stake in the existing international order and are therefore likely to stick with it. Okay. Wealthy nations can expect their wealth be protected, and poor countries can expect aid when they are desperate. Both strong and weak can expect international laws and norms to protect their interests one way or the other. So all the countries, one way or the other, despite their grievances with the existing international order, they don't want to give up. What about the future? To begin with, I think the decline of the West has made it increasingly difficult to impose the liberal interpretation of the world order. Okay. In the second place, the values of the future world order are likely to be more inclusive and more redefined, with China, India, and other developing countries have a larger voice. In the third place, decision-making in the future world order is likely to reflect the views and interests of non-Western countries, more so than before, such as those of the BRICS. In the fourth place, or finally, whether secular international order is sustainable depends on how major powers, especially China and the US, can find a way to contain the spillover of their differences and work together on issues of shared interests and stakes, including defending the existing international order. This requires both countries to put oneself into the other's shoes and to stand up to domestic political pressures and exercise foresight, courage, and wisdom. In a word, the future world order is likely to see continuities and changes. Like it or not, the existing international order is better than none. It's time for world leaders to wake up to the fact. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jia. And Professor Jia emphasized the the international leaders from the P5 should really give a serious concern about how to maintain the world order, and he feels the world order is inevitably will change dramatically. And now we started the second round for the discussion, and actually in the second round, and each of the participants, the panelists, you have the make your choice, and either you want to add more to what you already said to make them clarify. And second, you may want to say something responding to others, the other remarks, and you. Third, certainly for each of you, I will raise a question, and then you also can respond to that. And just now, Ambassador Nityev want to respond to this first. I would give you a question here. And so since, and you suggest, and the major powers, I mean the leading powers should and avoid a confrontation and for maintaining the world order and the peace. And currently, where they see, and including China, and where they have quite confronting relations among the major powers through the speech and the reality. So what's your suggestion? How to reduce the current confrontation among the P5 members? Yours? Yeah. And also,
yes. If you give me a right to respond, very good. As far as your question is concerned, well, I think that sooner or later we'll find out the common positions, since we all face threats which are enormous. I mean global situation, not just this or that particular crisis. There is a lot of crisis around the world, not only Ukrainian. That's why, for example, some countries in Asia, Africa are fairly pointing out that in the UN and other institutions that there is not only one Ukrainian crisis in the world, and we have to tackle others as well. But then some comment. Distinguished ambassador of the UK said, used that old Chinese formula, seeking truth from facts. I fully support such kind of attitude, but I kindly ask to turn to facts, not imaginary pictures and false narratives. As far as fake news and disinformation are concerned, I just want to address everybody to the documents of Security Council meeting on recent meeting on 28th of June, where Russian delegation has presented the detailed account of disinformation and fake news in and around that Ukrainian case. As far as refugees are concerned, yes, these people suffer a lot. But there are refugees not only in Europe, in my country as well. About 2 million people fled from Ukraine to Russia. Several 100,000 of them are kids, children. And my government and local authorities in the places where they are settling try to do everything in order to help them to come back to normal life. For example, all the educational documents of school children are being confirmed in Russia, and the middle school graduates are given a right to enter Russian universities just on a very beneficial basis. Food security, it's a burning issue, yes, it's true, but let's look at it just seriously. You mentioned, I still address to UK ambassador, you mentioned exemption of export of grain for Russia. Thank you very much. It's so kind of you, but please think about exemption on transportation, on delivery, on storage, insurance, reloading, and other operations which are tightly connected to the export of grain and cannot be separated. And please let me remind you that there is a lot of ways to take that grain from Ukraine. If somebody wants to do it, the shortest, easiest, and cheapest is through Belarus to Baltic ports. But false narratives prevail. That's why it's blocked. As far as you said, lift blockade on Ukrainian waters, there is no blockade. All the corridors are open. The latest step by Russia is withdrawing troops from the Snake Island near Odessa. The real impediment is mining of waters adjacent to the Ukrainian coast by Ukraine. Please demine, and then the way will be open. And just to seek truth from facts, not only facts, but figures as well. Just remind of several figures. In year 2021, Russia exported agricultural products to 161 countries. The total value, $37 billion US. The total volume, 71 million ton, including 43 million ton of grain. In 22, Russia's export will raise to 50 million tons. Plus fertilizers. In 21, it was 37 million tons of Russia's produced fertilizers. That is 25% of world export, and there is no blockade on that export. As far as Ukraine is concerned, according to Russia's figures and US figures, by the way, which are about the same, 5 million tons of wheat and 7 million tons of corn. From the point of view of overall, of global supply, grain supply, it is quite a share of 1%. So from that point of view, such strong wordings about blockade imposed on the whole world, which is suffering so much due to Russia's blockade, is imaginary case. Sorry for speaking so much about that. Quite okay. No, I have just two more. Distinguished Ambassador Billy, what you mentioned, the efforts by President Macron, what he has done in order to settle the Ukrainian crisis, as he said himself, 100 hours of talks with President Putin. Against that background, the most confusing is the fact that a couple of days ago, if not yesterday, France has disclosed the talks of Putin and Macron, made it public, which is clear, simple, and unique violation of all diplomatic etiquette. We have nothing to hide, nothing to cover. Putin told Macron, according to that papers disclosed, the same as he's repeating publicly time and again, but the mere fact, well, I'm not President Putin. I'm very humble and hapless ambassador. So to my very, very personal, very individual mind, I wonder how President Putin could speak to such persons, given the fact that everything could be disclosed. Aggression. Yes, it's a very strong word, and thank you to Professor Tia, who reminded about the aggression in Yugoslavia, in Libya, and I add Libya, Iran, Syria, let alone Afghanistan. So that's why who is aggressor? Everybody knows in this world. Then attacks on suffering of civilians in Ukraine. 2 days ago, day before yesterday, Ukraine has hit Ukrainian unguided missiles bombarded Russian city Belgorod, which is very close to the border, about 100 miles or so, and bombarded residential areas where no military deployment exists at all. 4 people were killed immediately, quite a big number is wounded, but the double tragedy is that 3 out of that 4 persons killed are Ukrainian citizens with Ukrainian passports who fled from Ukraine just to find out asylum in, not asylum, but hidden place in Russia. And finally, about proxy. That were my Foreign Minister of Russia Lavrov's words. I try to refer to it. The NATO, in essence, is in war with Russia through proxy and arming that proxy. War means war. But these words were just a reply, just an answer on the words by Secretary Truss of the United Kingdom, who said, the war in Ukraine is our war. So that is the fact. And finally, Second World War. Well, my very personal address to Ambassador Billy of France. I think if you don't want to hit Russia's historic memory, please never compare what happened to the Second World War and is happening in Ukraine now. And I don't want even to tackle the issue, to speak about it. I just want to say that if you look objectively on what's happening in eastern Ukraine, then you will see that ordinary people on the ground in these small townships in eastern Ukraine, in Lugansk region, which is totally liberated by local militia and Russian troops yesterday, I stress, just ordinary people on the ground. They welcome Russian troops with flowers. That is the fact. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. Now we move to American Ambassador Burns, and beside your response to the other remarks and your additional opinions, my question is that how to maintain the balance between the human rights and the sovereignty for international leadership.
Professor, thank you very much. The Russian ambassador has presented a series of facts. It reminds us of the famous political saying, Ambassador, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And you presented facts today that don't compare in any way, shape, or form to the reality of what's happening in Ukraine. The fact is you are blockading Ukrainian ports. You're intentionally bombing Ukrainian grain and agricultural centers, and that's depriving the rest of the world from the grain that's needed in this food crisis. So that's a fact, Ambassador, for your series of facts. I would also say on this, the Russian government has said consistently, and unfortunately it's been backed up by the government of the People's Republic of China, that somehow NATO caused this war. Let me remind you, Ambassador, that it was when we had NATO expansion in 2002 to 2004, I was the American ambassador to NATO, and we admitted 7 countries, Slovakia and Slovenia, Romania and Bulgaria, Estonia, and the Estonian ambassador is seated right here in front of me, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Those 3 countries had their independence robbed from them in May 1940 by the Red Army by virtue of Stalin's pact with Hitler, August 23rd, 1939, the deal that you made to carve up your predecessor regime to carve up Eastern Europe. Those countries freed themselves in 1991, the Baltic countries. They came into NATO. And for Russia now to assert that somehow 2 decades later, your feelings were hurt, you felt threatened by this, here's the fact. When the 7 countries came into NATO, we established alongside it the NATO-Russia Council. President Putin came to a summit to celebrate that. Russia was invited into NATO. Russia established a diplomatic presence inside the NATO compound. We met as ambassadors every week with our Russian counterpart. You accepted NATO enlargement. You dealt with all these countries. And now you try to say that somehow they don't have a right to their own independence and sovereignty? That is not a fact that will stand up in the court of law. Professor, thank you for your question. I think it's a good question, and I have so much respect for Professor Jia. Every time I'm with him, I learn something, and we've been together in academic conferences in the past. I would just say this. With respect to both of you, and with great respect, I don't accept that there's somehow kind of some tension between, on the one hand, sovereignty and territorial integrity, which are embedded in the United Nations Charter, and the other hand, human rights, which you describe as Western. The fact is that all member states of the United Nations must accept the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all the others. That's the bedrock principle. That's why we object to Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. But we also should expect that all members will uphold the human rights. And take a look at Articles 19 to 23 of the United Nations Charter. All of us, China, Russia, signed up to them. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of press, all the essential individual human freedoms. And take a look at the first and second sentences of the UN Charter itself. The individual is at the center of the United Nations, not just the state. And so I do not accept, with great respect, that there's some kind of tension between these two. We have to fulfill all of those rights given to states as well as given to individuals in the United Nations Charter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And 下面呢，我们请这个吴大使呢来回答吴瑞兰大使回答我提的一个问题。No, I have a question for you because you mentioned that uneasy peace. I know a lot of the Europeans and the American allies, including the U.S., and feel the war in the Ukraine fundamental change the world order. And when I'm talking about the uneasy peace, I think the situation didn't change, and in nature, it keeps the situation. And since the end of the post-Cold War, I regarded the UK's Brexit started a new age, the counter-globalization. And just now, this counter-globalization started with the trade war between China and the US, and with the pandemic, and the war in the Ukraine, and all these things just make the things, increase the uncertainty, the fear of the world. So we are talking about how to maintain the world order. So my question to you, and why you think the war in the Ukraine make the world order change fundamentally?
Well, I mean, Ukraine is a major, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the fact that Russia is not just any country, but is on this panel with us today and is a permanent member, no less, of the UN Security Council, is incredibly significant and fundamental. So quite beyond the impact on Ukraine, the fact is, as I and others have said, this is actually about the UN Charter, the basic tenets of the UN Charter. And you have to start from the basics sometimes. If you don't observe sovereignty, you don't observe human rights, you're going to struggle to do much else. I mean, Europe has had 77 years. I think the Nicolas Chapuis mentioned yesterday, we have overall, I think since the Second World War, done a remarkable job overall of trying to maintain peace and security. But this is a massive challenge. I think as for globalization, I think many of us represented here are still trying to actually pursue open trade. The question is open, free and fair. It's not just being open, but it's actually the rules underpinning it. And that is a very big issue, and it's a big issue here in China. And that is an incredibly important principle.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. And then I move to the Ambassador Lily. And you concern that if European countries can maintain the regional strategic balance, and then you can maintain the regional peace, that means European peace. But then our experience tells us, and this balance seems to me failed. After the Cold War, and there's war in Kosovo, the war in Georgia, the war now in Ukraine. So the balance of power in the Europe and didn't prevent the war from occurring, first. Second, seems to me the strategic balance in the Europe is a tilt in favor of the NATO members, right? the NATO expansion becomes bigger and bigger. So why the balance of power cannot prevent the peace in Europe?
Well, thanks. First, I would like to answer Ambassador Denisov because I like a lot the image of flowers. Okay. And speaking about truth, at the moment we speak, we have forensic police officers working in eastern Ukraine, investigated hundreds of corpses in mass graves, died, raped, and I hope we have time to present flowers to the invaders. Regarding your question to the balance in Europe, the prevention of war, I start my career at the time of Yugoslavia's war. It takes us almost, not a decade, but almost, if we go into Kosovo, to realize that we need some force to avoid bloodshed. At the beginning of the Yugoslavian war, we were really on the traditional UN peacekeeping mode between aggressor and attacked. And at a certain moment, we were fed up with the attack against peacekeeping missions, and we felt that we had to respond more strongly. As for Kosovo, it's somehow we have just to acknowledge that what was starting to spread in Kosovo was what we have seen before in Bosnia. Incredible aggression against civilian population. I don't think it was an easy decision to take, but it was the answer to a situation with an historic of nearly 10 years of brutal politics in the former Yugoslavia. Regarding the wave of NATO, expansion of NATO, I almost answered to that, because when I hear the word, waves of expansion, it reminds me Thailand and the tsunami. Maybe, as Ambassador Burns says, the first wave with 7 countries was significant, and it was an historical answer to an historical situation. But the follow-up waves, it has been really peaceful country. We thought that their participation to the European family had also a dimension in security while joining NATO. And again, it's sorry for our friends from Montenegro or Northern Macedonia, but I don't really feel that in any way Russia has felt in any way frightened by these new members. I may understand that they are more concerned with the new wave which is arriving, but that new wave is a direct answer to their policy and not the other way around. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now we move to Professor Jiang, and just notice that if all of the leading powers adhere to or respect the shared value and in the UN Charter. And then we can provide a collective leadership for this collective security. Now, Ambassador Burns said that, well, among the major powers, we have different values. We have value conflicts, right? So how can you make this distinction? On what level we have shared values, and on what level of the issues we have conflicting or different values? And so how to manage the relationship? Obviously, nowadays, everyone try to say, okay, I adhere to the shared value, the other side violate it, right? This is the both sides put the fingers at each other. So for you concern, how to make the UN and create a really shared value can be respected by all the leading powers?
That's a tough question. Actually, I think certain values are more broadly shared than others. Okay? Like the Western values, it's not about West attaches importance to human rights or other countries don't. It's not that kind of a divide. Actually, the West attaches certain human rights more than others. Okay, like China has made a tremendous progress in terms of uplifting people's living standard and also greater freedom of travel and live and that sort of thing. But the Freedom House rating of China's human rights situation actually went down. Okay. So they attach importance to certain set of values like civil and political rights, but they ignore or at least underestimate certain other values which a lot of other people, a lot of other countries believe that there are at least equally important, if not more important. Okay. So the UN Charter contains a lot of values. Okay. And also these values are subject to different interpretations. But what we need to do is to identify those values which we share and we give certain similar interpretations or priorities, and then work on that. On those, cooperate on the basis of those values, and at the same time contain the differences or manage the differences in which we have different opinions as to, whether they should be interpreted this way or that way, and then, try not to impose your own interpretation onto others. I think probably this is the only way for us to get out of the current problems. One of the ways to get out of the current problems. But one final word about the secular international order. Okay. I think that's at least equally important than the so-called liberal international order. Okay. Let's try to respect and defend that order first, and then talk about the liberal international order. When Russia, the secular international order is very pragmatic. Okay, actually, the UN was founded in a way to reflect the pragmatism. Okay. Remember the strange arrangement of the P5? They have veto powers. Okay. Why do they have veto powers? If you talk about democracy and everybody has the same right, why do you have the P5, permanent veto powers for the P5? Okay. Because pragmatic. Okay. You want to include all the major powers into it. Of course, it undermines the efficiency of the UN. But you don't want a P5 member to walk out of this and undermine the international order in a serious way. So that's why we need to return to pragmatism and face the realities of the world, okay, when we try to think about the world order. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Jia. Well, our time is over, but I really want to keep 15 minutes for the Q&A. Anyhow, even we wrapped up here, you cannot have food until 1 o'clock, right? Before 1, you have no food, so I think maybe we use the 15 minutes for the Q&A. So 2 regulations. First, identify yourself and before you raise question. Second, everyone can only raise 1 question. You have to direct your question to which and the panelists, and don't make too much remarks. Okay, let's start from the very first hand, the lady, and over there. Yeah, give that lady. No. Oh, okay. You're after him.
Thank you, Professor Yan. So my question is for Ambassador Burns. Every year around the 3,000...
Identify yourself. Okay, you forget my regulation.
I'm speaking for students. So every year around 3,000 to 5,000 Chinese students are denied visas under the proclamation 10043. So, and it's about 1/5 of all the students who major in STEM and want to study in the U.S. You have taught so many students, so I wonder, do you think Chinese students are spies? And do you think denying visas to these students will prevent espionage? How will the China-U.S. relations be improved if the U.S. sees China as a threat? Thank you.
Please.
Thank you for that straightforward question. As I said at the beginning of my remarks, Chinese students are welcome in the United States. I know that. I say that sincerely, personally, based on my experience teaching Chinese students over many years, well over 100 Chinese students. They're welcome. Last summer, 2021, our embassy and consulates here in China issued more than 100,000 student visas to Chinese students. So our door is open. Secretary of State Blinken, in his recent speech last month, said our door is open. We want Chinese students to come to the United States. I gave you the figures. Pre-COVID, we had about 375,000 Chinese students in the United States, by far the largest number of any national group. We want Chinese students to be there. We do have our law, and our law says if you lie on your visa application about your link professionally to an intelligence or military organization, you shall be turned down. So we do turn down some Chinese student visa applicants under that law, but it's a very small percentage. And 375,000 students in the States, that's a very big number. I hope that answers your question.
Okay. That girl in the, it's a different color for me to describe.
Does it work? I don't think it worked. Yeah, it works. I'm from Xinjiang Zhiku, the Beijing News think tank. My question is for Mr. Laurent Billy. Recently, I think the French has been playing a quite peculiar and special role in handling the whole Ukraine crisis. I mean, there have been hours of phone talks between Macron and Vladimir Putin, and Macron has been visit Kyiv recently. So my question is, what does French think that what role does it play, they think they can play in handling this crisis? And is French trying to expand its influence in the Euro-Pac and trying to be a more of a constructive and leading role as de Gaulle once did? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, which one you want to answer a question?
That is my...
That was for me.
Okay.
Well, thanks a lot. As you know, for the last 6 months, we have been the rotating presidency of the EU, so it gives us a certain role. And I also mentioned in my beginning of my speech, we enjoy traditionally a great deal of good relation with Russia. And so we are, one of the point of our talks was at the beginning or before the war was to try to prevent it and to try to act in a good, as a good faith partner of Russia to overcome the situation. Having said that, our main point is geography and history. Russia is in Europe, it's our neighbor, it's not going to change, and we are going to live together. So the better or the sooner we can stop that madness, maybe the shorter will be the healing process. Our only goal is to restore peace in Europe, to achieve as quick as possible a ceasefire, return to diplomacy, return to a normal world order where diplomatics is working and not the military.
Okay, thank you. And question? Okay, that gentleman.
Thank you. I'm from Bloomberg. Okay. I'd like to address the question to the Russian ambassador. Okay. We have talked a lot today, but there has been very little mention of what China can do in this situation in terms of its role in the international order. What would you ask President Xi Jinping to do in order to expedite a solution for the Ukraine war?
Okay.
And if I may, if I could also address the same question to Ambassador Burns. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your question. China's position on the Ukrainian crisis is quite reasonable and quite balanced. Basically, it is very, in few words, our colleagues here in China say that they clearly know where the roots of the Ukrainian crisis are and what are the historic causes of that crisis. And we appreciate China's many times expressed goodwill in order to be ready to facilitate the settlement if China can do something as a facilitator. And I think, yes, China can be and is doing it. First of all, raising its voice in international institutions on a very balanced way, calling all the sides to stick to more constructive position first. And the second, China has good relationship with Ukraine, and that's why I hope that in one way or another, China can send kind of a signal to our Ukrainian neighbors to be more realistic in the approach of the assessment of the whole situation. If we any side needs some mediator, I wonder whether it's helpful, but if so, then China also can play a role one day.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador Burns.
Well, I think that our government and our national leadership has been very clear from February 24th on that China should not provide material, economic, and military support for Russia in this war. And I know that as recently as just a few days ago, the White House has said it does not believe that China has done so. But we have recently sanctioned 5 Chinese companies, not the government of China, but companies for having violated that dictum. The second thing I would say in answer to the question is I would hope that the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson would stop accusing NATO of starting this war. That's Russian propaganda. And I think we've already determined that it bears no resemblance to Russian behavior. Russia accepted all of these new members of NATO, worked with them at NATO. It is simply propaganda. And I would hope the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson would also stop telling lies about American bioweapons labs, which do not exist in Ukraine. This is the behavior, both came from Russia, these lies. It's the behavior of an authoritarian regime that routinely doesn't tell the truth, Russia, and unfortunately has been picked up by the Chinese. That would be our request. Thank you.
Thank you. We still have time for questions, and I think this last one. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Yan. So I'm a university student, and I would like to ask the United States Ambassador, Mr. Burns, that you mentioned that you've been working in the UN for more than a decade, and you used to be the ambassador to NATO, right? So since you must be so familiar with these two organizations, so what is your view on the differences of roles played between UN and NATO in the Ukrainian crisis and the world issue to maintain world peace and order? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. I mean, obviously, I think we established at the beginning of the panel that the United Nations Security Council has statutory responsibility from 1945 in peace and security. All member states do. But the 5 countries represented here have that special permanent responsibility, and obviously my country has always taken that seriously. I'm very proud, I think we're all very proud of how NATO and the European Union have reacted to Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. You've seen NATO unify in a way, frankly, that I had not seen it unify for a very long time. You see the extraordinary situation of Finland and Sweden now joining the NATO alliance, which will strengthen us considerably, given the terrific work that Sweden and Finland have always done for peace and always done for European security. NATO unified. To see the European Union step up, extraordinary leadership. To see the leadership of the United Kingdom, member of NATO obviously, I think all of us have pulled together to say, and this gets back to the 2 professors' questions, we deeply believe in sovereignty and territorial integrity at the heart of the international order and the UN system. We are trying to defend it against Russia and to support Ukraine. And so I think that's what you defended against Russia and support Ukraine, is what I said, Ambassador. And that I think you're seeing the entire world rise up and say to the Russians, cease and desist in your illegal, unprovoked, barbaric war against the people of Ukraine.
Okay. Since there's no question directed to Ambassador Wilson and Professor Jia, I will give you two the final chance to make remarks, then we end this plenary. Please.
One of the things I was always told about Chinese foreign policy was that the one thing that China really, really believed in was territorial integrity and sovereignty.
Okay.
I'm not going to say any more.
Okay. Professor Jia.
Well, I think we have to be more pragmatic in dealing with international issues. Sometimes we have to put ourselves into others' shoes, or often we should, in order to understand what's going on. You know, one of the things that the Chinese government has been saying that you know, we understand Russia's agreements is because it's subjective. Of course, NATO has not threatened by you trying to push for expansion. But the problem is those countries try to join NATO. Okay, but you know, on the level of facts, this is the fact. You can say that NATO has not threatened Russia, but the problem is Russia feels that way. In international politics, subject thing matters. Yeah. So so somehow you have to take that into account in in pushing your own policies. So this is one thing that I think we need to pay attention to, especially when we talk about China-U.S. relations. We have to put ourselves into others' shoes in order to manage our relations well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Jiang. Just now, Ambassador Denisov required for a last sentence. And do you want to make it? And just a last sentence?
Yes. Thank you very much. When I hear about territorial integrity and sovereignty, I just remind only one word: Kosovo, full stop. Now, dear colleagues, it's not so easy to withstand all that criticism and blaming on my country, so I don't want to waste your time. I'm ready to answer any question, but maybe not here, we are limited. I can say only one thing. We in Russia, we Russian people, we know what's right and what's wrong. And President Putin on my country, he gains 81% of public opinion strongly supporting him or going far beyond his positions in international issues. And as compared, by the way, to 36, if I'm not mistaken, % of public support to President of the United States. And my final word, I strongly hope, maybe it's idealistic view, but I strongly hope that one day all our opponents will, in one way or another, recover their sight and came closer to what's really happening in the region and on the globe, and try to, as our Chinese friends say, it means to stand higher and try to look far.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I want to make the final mark for this panel. And although we're in a very difficult situation, like Ambassador Wilson said, and we find that we have a very civilized discussion here. We can deal with this violent situation and a very, very hostile relationship in a civilized manner. So I hope this discussion can set up a model for all of the major powers to concern how to handle their problems, conflicts, even confrontations between them in a civilized manner. Let us give the big applause for the 5 panelists, and they make a great contribution to us. Thank you. Thank all of you. Okay. And also here, I also thank all of this audience, and your attendance are very important to the success of this panel. And certainly I have to also thank all these logistical support people, journalists, and the interpreters and the technicians. Thank you. Many thanks to all of you for your participation. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you to all distinguished participants for the intriguing discussions. And we will now have a lunch. After the lunch, we will resume our plenary discussion at 2:30 p.m.